Okay, I'm going to quickly move to questions. So if anybody has a question, and ideally a question, not a statement of something, so ask a question and can you keep it as brief and concise as possible. I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and if you can direct your question at a panellist, if that's appropriate, can you do that? So if I can see hands up, so there's one here and one, so we'll start off with those 2 anyway. That might prompt more.
Hi there. Sebastian Hamilton from the Irish Daily Mail. We have a particular view on this, as you know. Just to ask the panel a simple question. What do you think is the youngest age at which a child should own their own smartphone? Not have access to the internet, but should be given their own smartphone? Thank you.
Okay, and the second question, which was back a little bit, yeah. And if you say who you are, that would be great. Who was the second question? Okay, and then there was another hand, yeah, behind. Okay, so we'll take those 3 questions, and then I'll go back to the panel.
Noel Howard, Social Care Ireland. It's about age again. In the context of the discussion, and it has been raised, and Grania said that this is the child protection issue of our time. If it is, isn't lowering the age of digital consent to 13 an absolute contradiction?
Okay, and was there another question? Okay.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask, excuse me, we spoke about a lot, particularly on the first panel, about the extreme issues like terrorism, child sex abuse and so on, which thankfully only affect a minority. What I'd be concerned about, and I wonder, are you as concerned, are the issues that affect a huge number, I think, particularly of younger people, which would be around the amount of screen time, particularly younger children are getting, and even adults, which leads to addiction. Anton spoke about looking now at the problems of the future. Another big concern, I think, would be anxiety in particularly younger girls, I think, from the use of social media. And I'm wondering, would you consider them issues? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to just pass it back to the panel, and if there are other hands, if you could indicate to that you're ready to ask a question. So who'd like to start off with that, with those 3? They're interlinked, those questions. I think, Brian, do you want to
Sure.
start?
There are key issues that have been raised in many different fora, and I think these are questions that are quite pointed because they're quite specific. And as a researcher, I always try and contextualize and put this in a wider context in terms of what evidence we have, what we know about what are the risks and so on. So in relation to smartphones, I really do kick back against this question sometimes because it's a particular device when we are living in an entire environment that is ever more connected, where we rely on information and using that information in all sorts of ways. It is a key question, I think, that many parents and children will have, and they need to be informed to be able to make that kind of decision. And it would be inappropriate of me to set out, there is a defined age. Of course, we have to take on all of the kinds of advice in terms of developmental appropriateness and what is good for a child and the child's evolving capacities to be able to use technology responsibly. And that is my response to this question and the issues that have been raised around this. It is a complex area and it's not one in which we can have a very simple answer, and I'm not sure that it actually helps the debate in terms of supporting children and protecting them, to put it in quite that way. Obviously, I share many of the same concerns that parents will have, and teachers and others who work with young people, and about their exposure as vulnerable young people, and will need to respond in an appropriate way around this. So similarly in relation, the child protection issue of our time, I do also sometimes push back against this, again singling out, because as we have discussed today, the internet is part of our lives now and is very much part of our future, and we have to think as deeply as necessary in terms of something that is so fundamental around that. And it does involve significant responsibilities towards provision and proper support and the quality of experience that young people have, and understanding where that experience is not what it should be. And I think it's in that context we have to have very necessary protections, but we have to look at it in that way. And I'm afraid that the same response in relation to screen time, there is a very understandable desire from parents to know how much is enough, how much is too much. But I know as I call myself a digital grandparent because I have a 6-month-old grandchild, and the digital experiences of children from the moment of birth and in that wider context now presses us to look at all of these issues around screen time, and the screen time, we feel like it is almost enforced on the very youngest, and it is within the environment in terms of our tablet devices, our games consoles, our uses of technology to communicate. We do need to go back to the developmental concerns, the educational concerns, and really help parents in terms of making sure that they're nurturing an environment that uses technology in beneficial ways.
Okay. Killian, you're a young person. I mean, should we take all those smartphones off everybody?
We're sort of like, we're moving into a new era now. It's like when, like back years and years ago, when we moved from like more ancient ways of writing on like rocks, whatever, to then going into like books, or like even just writing on paper. Do you think there was people then saying, no, keep writing on this rock, the paper is too advanced? Like, yeah, it's a stretch, but it's a similar sort of thing. We're moving from like what we used to have, where we always were writing on paper, to now we're moving to a more digital age where we're doing, like, some schools are bringing iPads and everything's done through school. So really, I don't think like there should be a limited age. It should be really up to the parent to decide themselves. Like there can be guidelines, but really it's up to the parent to decide, is their child mature enough to be able to handle it? And yeah, really.
Okay, thanks. Anton, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, that is the thing about the smartphone, is it's only in the context of all the other things. So if the child doesn't have a smartphone, but they spend all their time at home playing with the computer, that's just as much an issue. Or if they're at school and they spend all their time at the computer in the school, so it's quite a difficult issue, and it's quite a judgment, and you can't knock it on. In terms of anxiety, anxiety and addiction as a future. Addiction is certainly an interesting one, but anxiety, I have a feeling that teenage girls were always anxious, and they might be anxious about different things now, but that's part of growing up, and part of growing up is finding out to some extent about the darkness of the world and the darkness inside, and now it's happening through the internet instead of these other systems, instead of in the playground or at nightclubs or whatever it is. And I would say that the other side of it is how a young woman is empowered, for example. I think young women used to genuinely believe that models and people in magazines were genuinely a lot more beautiful than they were. But now they actually can go on YouTube and they can see the makeup video and they can see how the whole thing was put together with the green screen and all the rest. And so they seem very obsessed with it, but at the other side, there's also a sophistication emerging. On the consent issue, I don't have a strong view on what the age of consent, the digital age of consent. I would say there's a few things. It's very difficult to deal with this issue because sometimes kids don't give their true age when they fill in an online form. And the other issue is that consent is not the be-all and the end-all of data protection. Do people ever, and this is for adults as well, do they really know what they're consenting to? Is consent a carte blanche? There's still a lot of responsibility on the service provider to do the right thing with the data. And that goes across the board, and I think it's an important debate and something to discuss, but it's not the be-all and the end-all of it.
Yeah.
Okay, Grania.
Yeah, I'll maybe start with the third question, because I think we did touch on, but we maybe haven't talked enough about, and a number of people mentioned the distinction between legal and illegal, illegal and harmful behaviour. And a number of the calls to Childliner that come to the ISPCC are from young people who haven't been the victim of a crime but feel harmed and have been harmed. But we also work very closely with other organisations who provide therapeutic services to children who've been abused, and those services, such as Carrie, are woefully under-resourced. So I think there's a bigger debate to be had about what are the supports that currently exist for children and young people who have had some form of either harmful or criminal behaviour visited on them online. And I wouldn't want that to be missed from this piece, because we've talked a lot, I think, about the law and institutional frameworks and all that, but you know, there's a child in the middle of all this, and if a child has been harmed in some way, we need to ensure that they can access services. And I always say, because I've learned it since I've worked at the ISPCC, the method of a child's disclosure profoundly affects their ability to heal following abuse. So if a child believes they are listened to, if they can access services quickly, then they are much more likely to be able to continue with their childhood. So put that to one side. The second question, this is not an easy answer, and the ISPCC, we don't choose those kinds of questions. This is the digital age of consent, for example. We don't choose our answer lightly. We base it on evidence, we base it on what young people tell us. But the GDPR, first of all, is a major piece of legislation that evolves and is evolving in terms of protecting children's data. And as I said earlier, it is a game changer. It will entirely change how organisations, every organisation in this room, thinks about and processes children's data. So we didn't look first at the digital age of consent and go, we'll pick that age first. We looked first at how is the law changing? And the law is massively improving in terms of the protection of children's data. There are things that companies will simply not be able to do. They will not be able to exploit children's data. They will not be able to use it for advertising. They will not be able to sell it forward. And there's a whole range of things that this new law will immediately put into place. As I said earlier, how it's enforced, that's the big question. I spoke to a number of experts only in the last few days who have said to me they are worried about enforcement rather than the law. So that was the context in which we made that decision. Alongside that, we listened to young people who told us this. We will lie. If we want to access something online and age verification is weak, we will lie. So we have a responsibility as the National Child Protection Organisation when we make a decision to balance a whole range of things. And given how weak age verification is in a number of areas, some companies do it very well, others don't. There's no national accreditation for age verification in Ireland. There should be, but there isn't. We have taken the decision that given the legal context, the GDPR is significantly strengthening digital protection, and given all of the other things that we know about how young people think and behave online, we've made the decision that we believe it should be 13. I want to come on to the last question because they're both linked. The answer to this is evidence, and the answer to this is data. So I believe that we should build in to the Data Protection Bill a review. And I think we should look at and review whole aspects of how the bill works, or the Act as it will become works. And I have no problem if evidence shows us 3 years from now, 2-3 years from now, that actually the digital age of consent should be another age. I have absolutely no problem saying the evidence shows us it should be a different age. Let's go with that age. And I think what's missing generally, because this is such an emerging area, is as much evidence as we possibly can. And I feel really sorry for parents who have to, and this is to your point, Sebastian, who have to make decisions about, should I buy my child a smartphone for Christmas or not? That's a really difficult question for a parent to answer. And maybe it would be easier if a whole load of organisations put their hands up and said, this is the age it should be. The ISPCC will not make that call because we work with children with an entirely different range of both emotional and development needs, and we will never ever tell parents what to do. What we will do our very best is to give them some advice and direction and guidance, but we cannot remove a parent's right to make that really important decision. So that's the reason we give you that answer, and all of the 6 journalists who've called our offices in the last month on this campaign, I've given them the same answer. So thank you for that, Sebastian. You're keeping me busy.
Thank you. And finally, Niamh, do you want to briefly comment on?
Yeah, I think I probably have most to say about the third question. On the first one, I mean, it would only amount to a personal opinion. I don't know how valuable that is, but well, as a non-Facebook position on this, on a personal opinion, I think it probably falls to parents to decide what the appropriate age is. On the digital age of consent, Facebook didn't make a submission to the consultation. We are members of the American Chamber of Commerce and IBEC, who did make submissions on this. I don't really have much to say about it other than to say that I think there's a lot of, understandably, because this is, this is data protection law. It's not sort of an everyday topic that we'd be addressing on a regular basis. But I think there's a lot of confusion as to what it's about. Online safety is a hugely important topic. That's why we're all here today. And then, of course, data processing is a feature of that, but it's not about grooming, it's not about cyberbullying, it's not about all of those other things. And I think there's a huge conflation of all these issues when it comes to the digital age of consent. I suppose the one nexus where I do see them coming together is, as Grania and others have pointed out, where there's an incentive to lie about your age and to get around the checks and balances that companies like mine have in place. Because let's say you're a 13-year-old and you decide to say you're 16. For 2 years, you will receive the same in-app education around privacy and safety that I was talking about, and you'll be protected from the kinds of ads that we feel shouldn't be served to under 18s, like I said, gambling, dating, certain types of health products focused on dieting. But once that child hits 15 and the system thinks they're 18, all of those protections will go away. So I think that's where there's an issue. But the other thing I say, and I'm big into this at the moment because I've been doing a course in data protection law, is that consent is only one of several legal bases for processing data. And the nature of consent under the GDPR is that if you decide not to consent to the specific processing purpose that you're asked about, and they can't be bundled anymore. It has to be consent for each specific process. If you don't consent, you can't be penalised for that, meaning it can't be a take it or leave it approach. So things like sensitive categories of personal data, which include things like your religious views, your political views, your sexual orientation, they must require consent. You must, if they're to be processed. And you can imagine that would apply to a dating app, so they'd have to look for consent on that. There are other situations where it would arise as well. For example, around use of biometric data. Facebook has a product called facial recognition, which isn't operational in the EU, but there will be a consent moment around that. And because it's biometric data, you must ask for consent. But if you're asking for consent and there's some detrimental effect that would follow if you don't consent, then that's not the correct legal basis. It's supposed to be one of the others, be that legal obligation, contractual necessity, legitimate interest for a business, whatever it be. And that's, again, back to this point about education. I think we really need to explore all of the issues this raises and try and bring people up to speed on what all of this means, because it's not something that's going to come and go with the data protection bill that's passing through. It's something that's going to be with us moving forward to an increasing degree. So it's not an answer to your question, but I think it's worth clearing up some of those issues, because I think a lot of people assume that consent means consenting to terms and conditions. Yeah. It's not the case.
Okay, great.
Oh, sorry, I never answered. Do you mind if I just briefly on the third question? Sorry. We are focusing a lot more on well-being and meaningful interactions. This is something that's emerged over time. We conducted some research recently about time being well spent on our platform, and what came out of that was that passive scrolling through your news feed is not good for your mental health, whereas meaningful interactions with people is extremely good for your health. Sorry. That's a sentence I reached for. I don't want to say extremely. Is better for you and not a draw on your mental health. So we're trying to focus more on well-being. Also, Instagram is part of the Facebook family of apps. There's a huge focus on body image around Instagram as well. So we make sure to partner with the organisations that have the expertise in areas around eating disorders, and we make sure that we have strong, robust policies around anything that promotes or glorifies eating disorders, and also that resources are available to our users to make sure that if they're dealing with that problem, that they get the right resources to them. So I think your question is a good one.
Okay. Is there anybody in the room with a question that absolutely has to be asked? You can't leave the room without asking it. In other words, we haven't really thrashed it out. So there's 3. I'm going to take them very quickly, and I'm going to ask one panellist to answer. So you need to name the panellist you'd like to answer. Okay?
Thank you.
Choices.
For that. Thank you. My name is Ciaran McMahon. Thanks to the organisers for the conference. Given that it is an open policy debate, I would like a panelist to give us one specific, clear policy recommendation that they would like the government to put into place by the end of the summer. I believe is the recommendation, and I'll put that to Grainne Long.
Okay, well, I mean,
I'll take the 3 questions and then you can answer them.
Yeah.
So you have a minute to capture your thoughts. Okay, what was the second question and who's it for?
Mark Carpenter from Sky Ireland's for Brian. It's actually quite similar. It's very, very quickly, of the recommendations in the Internet Content Advisory Report, which do you think, of those that haven't already been implemented, which do you think should be the priority?
Okay, and there was a final hand up. Okay.
Hi, my name's Sarah Leader and I speak to children and parents in schools about online safety. One thing that hasn't been discussed, and I think I keep hearing, oh, the internet is part of our lives, it's all we can do, but something that really is, I hear all the time in schools is how much time very young children are spending online. Smartphones are coming back, and again, it's not the problem. Smartphones not the problem. It is tablets. So many very, very young children have access. They're giving tablets at a very young age. I had a parent recently. A number of parents asked me to recommend a tablet for. I said, "What age is your child?" Junior infants. That's not uncommon. So I just don't understand why that's something we're not talking about. You know, the increasing amount of time, maybe directed towards me from Facebook to talk about that, with particular emphasis on the fact that actually that a lot of the Silicon Valley crowd don't allow their children access to these devices until 12, because no one seems to want to say, oh, you know, I don't agree with them under a certain age, you know, leave it to the parents. But we need guidelines on this. You know, I say to parents, do you want your child to be the guinea pig? To see, you know, throw them out there, let's see how they fare in their life going forward. But particularly with emphasising young children, buggies, I see them in buggies, I see them all in restaurants. And it seems to be normalised behaviour, and I don't think that's right. Okay. I think we needed a conversation about that.
Okay, so the first question was Grainne.
Yeah, look, I think I would essentially ask of government now to put the action plan in place by the summer. But I think that action plan has to include what I said earlier. I would love to see an Irish Council for child internet safety, and I'd like to see that council being the group of people or types of organisations in this room, because I don't think this action plan, while it has to be driven by government, I think it needs to be owned by everybody who's in this space, so to speak. And I would expect to see that. And as part of that, planning for an Office for Digital Safety Commissioner with teeth, you know, with the powers. I mean, regulators only work when they have the power to regulate and really regulate, not self-regulation, regulate, and, you know, have the power to initiate investigations, have the power to enforce. That costs money, I know that, but I think that is specifically what we need. And I really agreed when somebody likened it to the Road Safety Authority. I think when we think about it in that way, it seems crazy that we don't have a national body that's thinking about the safety of our children online. Can I really quickly just answer your point? You're absolutely, totally right. You know, and maybe I didn't make that strong enough when I was talking earlier about evidence. I think a national office should be giving parents the kind of data and the kind of evidence to help them make that choice. How they make that choice will then be up to them. And I suppose that's my point. It's not for me to tell parents what to do, but I would have absolutely no problem nodding to a national office who's gathering data that is accepted and acceptable and recognised probably by the European Commission. So I think that's missing, and I do really feel very sorry for parents when they have to make those judgments without that data. Okay. Which recommendation? I think that was addressed to you, Brian.
Great. The ICAG report, I'm delighted that it is having an airing because it had a menu of some 30 recommendations across a whole range of governance issues. The trigger for it really is the establishment of a National Council for Internet Safety. You know, we listened carefully to the Byron report at the time, and what's interesting is there's kind of a circular element going on here, because the Byron review referred very favourably to Ireland's Office for Internet Safety, and we looked at you know, what provision are we making centrally to give as that resource. But we presented a National Council, much like this body as we're talking about here, which would be a trigger for all of the other elements that we feel would be a good, you know, a good start, a good platform to get underway. Yeah.
Niamh, do you want to add anything to Grainne's comments in relation to the guidance for parents and very small children?
Oh, sorry, I thought you meant guidance for parents and enabling them. Actually, we've created a lot of resources. We have a parents portal to try and help people. Webwise have done a great job of building together a bunch of resources to help enable parents. On the point of access, I I have 3 sisters, they all have children. I know they probably wouldn't have got through it if they didn't have In the Night Garden on the tablet at some point. But I think it's worth pointing out, and
I want to hand over to the Minister, but I'm conscious that you were at the Cabinet meeting for a while.
13 to use WhatsApp or Instagram. And so I think there was an example given earlier on of an 11-year-old who was using an app and was served an ad for lip fillers, and the mother pointed this out. I mean, there's so many things captured in that point. I don't know of any apps for under 13s that would be serving ads for lip fillers. So there you have the knowing facilitation of somebody who shouldn't be on an app by somebody acknowledging so we know that they've lied to get onto the app because they're 11 instead of 13, and there's a good chance then that they've lied and said they're over 18. So I think the point I'm arriving at is you're really up against it when it's being facilitated by a guardian or somebody like that. But at what point do they start to get access to a device? Again, our education and materials and resources, they all start at 13 up because that's the age you must be. So it's probably not that helpful to you.
Sure.
So I get that, but I mean, I suppose if you wanted to, you could put something for passport in their place instead of look to get in there. It's obvious from the content they're sharing, I think, what age they are. They're not 18. You know? I would say it's an easy thing to say, oh, well, our apps are advised for 13 years old, and that's how that's what's working, particularly with Instagram and Snapchat. Primarily Snapchat, obviously you're not affiliated with them, but Snapchat is, they all have it at that age.
No, I did meet with the new head of policy for Snapchat in London a couple of weeks ago, and we discussed all of these issues, so I know it's top of mind for them as well. As I said earlier, I think people assume technology is more sophisticated than it is. It's like you'd surface a lot of false positives and then you require human review. I think our resources and time are probably better spent invested in other areas where we can make a real difference. But I will say this, I regularly get people saying to me, I see a 7-year-old on Facebook or I see a 9-year-old on Instagram, and I say, well, why aren't you reporting it? Because that's the best way we can take action, is when it seems there's a lot of people who know about underage accounts and maybe they don't know how to report it, and that's on us. We need to do more education about that, but it's a very simple process, and so I think we all have to step up and say, well, if we see something.
You know, you can't get a credit card if you're a child. You won't be allowed to. The bank will find out that you're not the age you say you are. Your Facebook, you've got hundreds of billions of dollars suspended. Could you not commit to establishing, at the very least, that the children who say they're a certain age actually are?
I mean, we do have certain technological fixes in place, but look, as Killian was pointing out, there are ways around these things, but also we're a global platform. What do you do if you're a child in Ghana and you don't have access to your parents' credit card, or you don't have access to your national ID? I think we have to remember there are limitations in place. You're going to exclude a lot of people, but certainly, you know, it's an issue. There's no doubt about it. But as I said, there are limits sometimes to what the technology can do, and that's the GDPR references that. It talks about the available technologies when it comes to parental authorization. So while we obviously have plans in place to deal with that, I wouldn't ever go as far as to say they're foolproof.
Okay, I'm going to draw this to a close, but I think it's probably a good point to draw it to a close, because it's indicative of the kind of issues that need continuous discussion and a lot more teasing out, and presumably a lot more development over time, both in terms of the technology but also parental education.